What we do here is go back.
Well, there is a substage forum today. The presidential candidates, as well as those for VP External and Operations and Finance, introduced themselves to the students this afternoon, as well as the Student Events Initiative plebiscite. There were a couple main focuses from the candidates. A lot of people thought tuition was unaffordable, and that international students were forgotten about.
We've seen how the university really wants to continue pushing forward international student tuition.
For example, the university increasing international tuition fees. Education costs a lot more than you used to.
Yesterday, the Board of Governors at the Finance and Property Committee voted to increase international students' tuition, rent, and meal plan costs.
Some touched on the upcoming provincial election, and Adam Brown made sure everyone knew he was focused on weed.
I want to look at supporting our communities. We need to have a discussion on the legalization of cannabis, how that's going to roll out, and how students can be best informed with this.
The presidential candidates were grilled on their platforms and what they would change. None of what they said was especially memorable, but here's the gist. Question of the day came when presidential candidates were actually pushed for tangible action points on council relations with Indigenous students. Whether or not they actually delivered answers, you can decide.
A lot of you are talking about expanding communication with Indigenous groups. What is one tangible way you're going to do that?
Bringing Indigenous students to the table, especially in advocacy, is incredibly important. And we can do a much better job of that when we meet with external stakeholders. I'm a big fan of work that's been done in Ontario or even federally, which approaches student advocacy for Indigenous issues as a nation-to-nation relationship.
One tangible thing I will do is I will continue to sit an Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation Committee and work together with everyone to ensure that Aboriginal student relationship and voice is heard within the Students' Union context. That committee needs to be successful in the years to come.
In terms of myself, one of my platform points is creating a coalition of Aboriginal student groups. So not to center the Students' Union and our needs, but to work with Aboriginal student groups to uplift and empower those groups. To a social activist kind of term is like doing the dishes, so doing the grunt work.
For the OPSFI race, we learned that the only real candidate, Emma Ripka, will continue the Student Events Initiative and Meyer Horowitz renovations. The Joe candidate didn't show up. The fact that this race remains uncontested is a shame, as we've never really seen any real opposition to the SEI or Meyer Horowitz renovations. Both of these have been main focuses of current OPSFI Robin Patches. Speaking of the SEI, we got a couple questions answered today by the yes side of the plebiscite vote as to how the $100,000 lump sum would be spent, as well as the reasons why the MyHo renovations are going forward. And that was pretty much it. Honestly, this forum was boring outside of watching the presidential candidates sweat during the question about SU's relations with Indigenous stakeholders. I don't think we're seeing the same separation of platforms and opposition of ideas that the 2017 SU elections were defined by. There's not a lot between presidential candidates in terms of ideas or backgrounds, as all three are current VPs. For me, this race is going to come down to who the voters like the most on the level of personality and not necessarily ideas. OPSFI is essentially uncontested, so there's not really much to write home about that race. In the external race, I'm concerned with none of the candidates including consultations with U of A Protective Services when it comes to cannabis legalization. That's a bit of a gimme answer to this question, and none of the candidates took advantage. I was excited for the SU election cycle to start up again, but with the late cancellation of last night's Lister forum and late rescheduling, as well as the blandness of today's forum, it's hard to think how students outside of the governance bubble will really be engaged by this year's candidates and the races.